Water. Humanity has always looked upon it as the giver of life. It nourishes the body, cleanses the soul, and in the Christian tradition, it baptizes the innocent into salvation. The baptismal font, carved in stone, polished by generations of faithful hands, was never meant to be a site of fear. It was a place of hope, where babies cried only for a moment before being passed back to their mothers, dripping with the promise of redemption. But in Richmond, during the rigid years of Victorian England, water was weaponized. In the shadow of holy ritual, it became something far more sinister. In the still surface of that font, infants would not rise again. Instead, they would sink into silence, leaving behind families broken and communities baffled. What should have been a symbol of new beginnings became the backdrop of unthinkable endings. At the center of this dark tale was one woman, Mary Ann, a servant, a shadow, a figure so ordinary in appearance that no one thought to look twice. She was entrusted with the lives of the most vulnerable. Her hands, accustomed to washing linens and tending fires, were also permitted to hold babies, to soothe them, to carry them to and from the sacred spaces of the household. Those same hands, history would later reveal, became instruments of destruction. To understand the horror of what Mary Ann did, we must first confront the paradox of her chosen stage, the baptismal font. For centuries, the act of baptism represented purity, forgiveness, and eternal life. Even in the most grief-stricken households, the thought of a baptism brought light. It was supposed to guarantee that, no matter what struggles lay ahead, the child's soul was safe in the eyes of God. Families clung to that hope. They needed it. And yet, Mary Ann twisted that hope into despair. She used the trust of ritual, the blind faith of parents and clergy, as a cover. Imagine the scene. The stone basin filled with cool water, the light filtering in through stained glass, a child squirming in anticipation or discomfort. The font stood as a quiet witness, its sacred waters rippling not with blessing, but with the frantic final moments of life. The story we're about to tell is not just about murder. It's about betrayal on a level so profound it rattled the very foundations of Victorian belief. How could a servant, a woman of humble station, infiltrate the most sacred aspects of a household and commit such crimes without detection? How could entire families lose not one, but multiple children to the same sinister fate? Part of what makes this story endure, why it still chills over a century later, is how ordinary it all appeared. There were no screams echoing through the streets, no bloody weapons discovered under floorboards, no dramatic chases by lantern light. There was only silence. Infants slipped away in what seemed like accidents, tragedies written off as the will of God or the frailty of childhood. And in that silence, Mary Ann thrived. Think of the contrast. Upstairs, in the grand halls of Richmond's wealthy homes, life bustled on. Families entertained guests, read newspapers, and made polite conversation, never suspecting that downstairs, the woman folding their linens and polishing their silver was already plotting how to lead their children to the font. It is this duality, light and dark, faith and betrayal, water as life and water as death, that makes Mary Ann's crimes so disturbing. They force us to re-examine how symbols can be corrupted, how trust can be weaponized, and how evil so often hides in plain sight. This story does not begin with a scream, nor does it end with relief. It unfolds slowly, methodically, as if Mary Ann herself wanted the horror to seep in gradually, drop by drop, like water filling the font before the plunge. By the time her crimes came to light, 2 generations of children had been lost, babies, toddlers, the heirs of households that once believed themselves untouchable. Their lives extinguished in the very place that was supposed to promise them eternal life. In the chapters ahead, we will walk through the world Mary Ann inhabited, the strict hierarchies of Richmond society, the hidden pressures of servitude, and the psychological shadows that may have driven her. We will retrace the steps of her murders, uncover how suspicions grew, and finally confront the chilling trial that forced an entire community to grapple with the darkness living among them. But first, let us linger in this opening image, the baptismal font, ancient stone carved to cradle water. To the devout, it meant rebirth. To the families of Richmond, it became a tomb. And to Mary Ann, it was a weapon, silent, merciless, and unforgettable. To understand Marian's story, we must step into the world that shaped her. Richmond in the 19th century was a town caught between elegance and shadow, privilege and poverty. Its cobblestone streets carried the carriages of wealthy families, while just a few steps away, cramped servant quarters housed those who lived and labored unseen. The Victorian period was obsessed with appearances. Families measured their worth not only by their wealth, but also by their morality and their ability to maintain a polished household. Behind that polished veneer stood servants, maids, cooks, nannies, whose endless work made their masters' lives appear effortless. The lives of these workers were invisible by design. They were expected to serve without question, to disappear into the background, to erase themselves for the comfort of those above them. Mary was one of these shadows. To most families in Richmond, she was simply another servant girl, interchangeable, unnoticed. And yet, this invisibility gave her an extraordinary power. No one asked what she thought or felt. No one wondered if she was content. As long as the fires burned and the floors gleamed, her inner world was of no concern. That silence, the social blindness of Victorian society, was fertile ground for secrets to grow. Servants were often caught in a cruel paradox. They lived among wealth, but never touched it. They cared for children who would inherit fortunes, while knowing their own lives would end in anonymity. They prepared lavish meals they could not eat, cleaned fine clothes they would never wear, and bowed their heads in churches where they had no pew reserved for them. The resentment, the quiet sense of injustice, could build over years like pressure beneath the surface of a calm river. Religion played an enormous role in shaping this environment. The church was a central pillar of life in Richmond. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, all passed through its doors. Servants like Mary were raised in a culture that preached obedience, humility, and acceptance of suffering. It is no coincidence that the baptismal font became both her cover and her weapon. It was the one place where class distinctions blurred, if only for a moment. At the font, master and servant knelt together. The water touched all equally. And perhaps, in Marian's mind, that equality extended to death. The baptismal ritual itself carried weight in Victorian society. Infant mortality was tragically common. Many children did not live to see their 5th birthday, and families clung to baptism as a guarantee that, even if the child did not survive, their soul would be safe. Priests, parents, and godparents all leaned on this sacred act to ease their fears. It was precisely this vulnerability, this desperation to believe in divine protection, that Mary manipulated. We cannot ignore the strict hierarchies of gender at the time. Women in service had little control over their lives. Many were employed from their teenage years, often until they married, if they ever married at all. They lived under the authority of mistresses who judged them constantly, and masters who sometimes exploited them. The psychological toll of being treated as disposable property cannot be underestimated. Some bore it quietly, some ran away, and a few, like Mary, found darker ways to assert control. It is tempting to ask, was Mary simply a product of her environment? Did the rigid class system, the suffocating morality, and the daily humiliations of servitude twist her into what she became? Or was something far more personal and pathological at work? While historians and psychologists may debate this, what remains clear is that Richmond in the 1800s created the perfect stage for her crimes. Consider this. Every wealthy home had a servant like Mary, someone who knew when the children were left unattended, who understood the routines of the family, who moved silently through the most intimate spaces of the household. A stranger would have aroused suspicion immediately, but a servant could linger unnoticed, blending into the background of daily life. Invisibility became her camouflage. The contrast is chilling. Upstairs, the family might gather around the fire, laughing, reading the latest serial in the newspaper. Downstairs, Mary in polished silver or washed clothes, her mind perhaps already dwelling on the cold stone font in the church. The gap between these two worlds, the world of privilege and the world of servitude, was more than social. It was emotional, psychological, and, in Marian's case, lethal. And yet, in Richmond, few questioned this system. It was simply the way things were. Children were handed to servants without hesitation. Servants escorted them to church, to parks, even to bed. Trust was not optional, it was required. Families depended on it. They could not imagine betrayal because betrayal was unthinkable. This is where Mary Ann's story begins to take on its darkest dimension. She did not kill in alleyways or forests where danger was expected. She killed within the safest spaces families knew, within the walls of their homes, and within the walls of their churches. The very institutions meant to protect children became the stage for their destruction. By the mid-1800s, Richmond was a place both deeply pious and deeply blind. The wealth of some coexisted with the invisibility of many. Rituals meant to comfort were sometimes little more than illusions. And it was in this fragile balance, this theater of appearances, that Mary Ann lived. When we imagine her walking through the streets of Richmond, she likely looked like any other servant girl. Head down, clothes plain, hands calloused from work. No one turned their head to follow her. No one suspected the storm gathering behind her eyes. The world around her, its rules, its rituals, its blindness, allowed her crimes not only to happen but to remain hidden for years. In the eyes of Victorian Richmond, Mary Ann was nobody. But as history would reveal, she was far from invisible. She was watching, she was waiting, and soon she would strike. By the time Mary Ann entered the service of Richmond households, she was already a ghost in plain sight. There are few surviving records of her early life, and perhaps that silence itself is telling. She was not born into prominence, nor was she destined to leave behind diaries or letters. Her life was shaped by labor, repetition, and anonymity. What we know comes from fragments, parish registries, trial records, and the whispered memories of those who later spoke of her with unease. Mary Ann was not described as violent, nor was she remembered as strikingly beautiful, charismatic, or rebellious. Instead, she was ordinary, almost painfully so. She slipped into households the way a shadow slips across the floor, seen, but not acknowledged. And in that ordinariness, she found cover. Families never imagined that the woman ironing their linens or cradling their children could harbor a darkness so profound it would stain generations. To understand her role, we must understand the peculiar intimacy of domestic service. Servants were both inside and outside the family. They shared the same roofs, walked the same hallways, and even overheard the most private arguments. And yet, they were not equals. They could witness everything but were expected to speak of nothing. They held babies in their arms, but knew those children would one day become their social superiors. Servants lived in the contradiction of being indispensable but disposable. Mary Ann, by all accounts, fulfilled her duties quietly. She did not stir gossip with flirtations or drunkenness, as some servants did. She kept her place. But there were whispers, small, unsettling details that, in hindsight, seem like warnings. Some described her as too still, her gaze lingering on children longer than seemed natural. Others recalled a faint coldness in her manner, as if warmth was a performance she delivered only when required. Psychologists today might call this detachment. Some might even speculate about deeper disorders, psychopathy, an inability to empathize, or a fixation on control. But in her own time, these traits simply went unnoticed. Servants were not examined. Their inner lives were not a matter of curiosity. They were expected to function, not to feel. What becomes chilling in Mary Ann's story is the way her position gave her not just access, but authority. Parents trusted her. She could lift a child from a cradle without question. She could accompany a family to church and be handed the most precious life in the household without hesitation. In a society where servants were considered extensions of the family's will, Mary Ann wielded power she should never have had, the power to end lives, unseen and unquestioned. Imagine the dynamic in those households. The masters and mistresses might scold Mary Ann for failing to polish silver properly or for letting dust gather in a corner, yet they thought nothing of entrusting her with their infants. They saw her flaws in trivial matters but blinded themselves to the possibility of true danger. And Mary Ann, silent and watchful, learned from this. She understood that her invisibility was her greatest weapon. We cannot know precisely when her fascination with drowning began. Perhaps it was rooted in childhood experiences, perhaps in the religious imagery that surrounded her. Water, after all, was omnipresent in sermons, in hymns, in ritual. The font itself was a symbol she would have seen countless times. Its stone surface, its still basin of water. To the faithful, it represented cleansing. To Mary, and, perhaps, it whispered of something darker, a way to control life and death with nothing more than her hands and silence. This fixation, if we can call it that, would have been nourished by her isolation. Servants had little freedom. Their lives revolved around chores and obedience. If Mary Ann felt resentment, if she yearned for control, the font offered both secrecy and symbolism. It was the one place where she could mask violence as devotion, where the line between ritual and reality blurred. When we think of serial killers today, we imagine grand spectacles of violence. But Mary Ann's crimes were the opposite. They were quiet, calculated, and almost invisible. She did not draw blood or leave marks. She needed only a few moments of trust, a basin of water, and a child too young to resist. Her crimes were built on subtlety, the kind of subtlety that left families blaming fate, illness, or divine will rather than the servant in their own home. Those who later tried to piece together her psychology asked a haunting question. Did Mary Ann feel anything? Did she grieve after the deaths? Or did she relish the funerals she helped arrange? Some suggested she was utterly detached, treating each death as nothing more than an event. Others believed she may have drawn satisfaction from watching grief ripple through the households that had held power over her. If so, her murders were not just acts of violence, but acts of rebellion, twisted assertions of dominance over families who believed themselves untouchable. There is a cruel irony here. Servants were often treated as invisible, yet in death, their actions could overshadow the very families they served. Generations later, no one remembers the names of the masters whose children Mary Ann drowned. Their wealth, their status, their grand homes, all have faded. But Mary Ann remains remembered, not for her servitude, but for her crimes. The shadow outlived the light. By the time suspicions began to circle her, Mary Ann had already woven herself deeply into the fabric of Richmond households. She had lived among them, laughed politely when required, folded their linens, tended their fires, and all the while, she carried a secret hunger that no one saw. Her presence was a paradox. She was always there, feeding babies, carrying them to church, kneeling at the font. And yet, she was never truly seen. It was this paradox that allowed her to strike again and again, without anyone daring to ask the simplest, most dangerous question. What if the servant was the threat? In the stillness of Mary Ann's demeanor lay the seeds of tragedy. She was the quiet shadow, moving through the lives of 2 generations of children, unnoticed until it was too late. And soon, she would take her first step from shadow into horror, guiding a helpless infant toward the stone font, where devotion ended and death began. The first time Mary Ann carried a child to the baptismal font, there was no hint of what was to come. The family believed it was an act of devotion, an obedient servant accompanying them to church, ensuring the infant would be blessed and welcomed into the community of faith. The church doors opened to the echo of bells, sunlight filtered through stained glass, and the child whimpered softly in her arms. Nothing seemed out of place, but what appeared to be a sacred ritual would soon twist into something else entirely. Victorian churches were built to inspire awe. Their vaulted ceilings and shadowed corners carried the weight of centuries of ritual. For the faithful, every stone whispered of eternity. For Mary Ann, those shadows provided cover. The font, cold, heavy, carved from stone, stood waiting. Its water shimmered faintly in the dim light, meant to symbolize purity, but in her hands, it became something far more sinister. Accounts suggest her first murder went unnoticed because it was cloaked in familiarity. Babies often struggled during baptism, crying, flailing, even choking briefly on the water. To parents and priests, these were normal signs of an infant's discomfort. But Mary Ann lingered. She pressed down too long, her hands steady, her expression calm. The cries faltered, then fell silent. By the time the child was pulled back, limp and motionless, it was too late. The explanation came easily. The child had been frail, sickly, a victim of fate. The family mourned, but they did not suspect foul play. In the Victorian era, death was common enough that even tragedy could be rationalized. One lost infant was heartbreaking, but not unimaginable. Mary Ann's secret remained safe. Yet she did not stop. In the months that followed, another child was brought to the font, this time a cousin of the first, born into the same household. Again, Mary Ann was there. Again, the ritual unfolded under the solemn eyes of clergy and family. And again, she found a way to press the child beneath the surface just long enough to silence their cries forever. 2 children, 2 generations, drowned in the same sacred water. Still, suspicion did not fall on her. The deaths were deemed tragic coincidences, cruel twists of fate. Families turned to prayer for comfort, never daring to question whether the very hands they trusted most were to blame. It is difficult for us, looking back, to comprehend how such crimes could go unnoticed. But in Victorian England, infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. Cholera, consumption, fevers, disease carried children away with frightening regularity. A baby's death could be written off as inevitable, even in wealthy families. And Mary Ann exploited this grim reality with chilling precision. The method itself was horrifying in its simplicity. Drowning leaves little evidence, especially when disguised as baptism. No blood, no wounds, no clear sign of struggle. A baby's frail body bore no marks of violence. The priest, believing he had only performed his sacred duty, would see nothing amiss. Parents, blinded by grief and the assumption of divine will, never thought to blame their servant. Mary Ann had found the perfect weapon, water, sanctified by the church itself. What motivated her remains a matter of speculation. Was it resentment toward the families she served, a way of asserting dominance over those who commanded her life? Was it a perverse fascination with the act of drowning itself, the stillness, the silence, the moment of control? Or was it something even darker, the thrill of holding life in her hands and extinguishing it at will? Whatever her reasons, Mary Ann became bolder. Some historians suggest that her murders stretched across multiple households in Richmond, leaving behind a trail of unexplained infant deaths. Each family grieved in isolation, never realizing their tragedies were connected by the same shadow moving through their lives. Imagine the chilling repetition: a baby dressed in white, carried into the church. The priest intoning prayers. The font, its water cool against stone. Parents smiling nervously, reassured by tradition. And Mary Ann, her face composed, lowering the child into the basin. A splash, a cry, a pause, and then silence. Each time, grief descended like a shroud, and each time, Mary Ann walked away unscathed, her secret intact. The horror lies not only in the deaths themselves, but in the trust that made them possible. These families handed their children to Mary Ann willingly, never doubting her loyalty. The priests stood by, believing they were saving souls, not witnessing murder. The church itself became her accomplice, not knowingly, but through its blindness to the possibility of evil within its walls. As the pattern grew, whispers began to circulate. Some parishioners remarked on the uncanny repetition of tragedy in the households Mary Ann served. Others muttered about the eerie calm that seemed to follow her, as if grief clung to her presence. But suspicion was slow to take root. After all, who could accuse a servant girl of such monstrous acts without proof? To do so would be to question the sanctity of the church, the trust of families, the very fabric of society. And so Mary Ann continued. 2 generations of children, cousins, siblings, heirs to Richmond families, were drowned in the same stone font. The pattern was invisible only because no one wanted to see it. For the families, the losses were devastating. They held funerals, wept over small coffins, and turned to Scripture for comfort. But Mary Ann, the quiet shadow in the background, carried no visible grief. She attended services, folded linens, and moved through her duties as if nothing had changed. Her ability to mask emotion, to blend seamlessly back into routine, was perhaps her most terrifying skill. We are left to wonder, did she feel satisfaction as she watched parents grieve? Did she find power in knowing that she had struck at the heart of households that once commanded her obedience? Or did she detach entirely, moving from one murder to the next with the cold precision of someone who saw children not as lives, but as opportunities? What is undeniable is the terror she left behind. Though families did not yet understand it, a pattern had emerged, a pattern that would eventually become too clear to ignore. The church that had baptized generations now carried whispers of curses. The font, once a symbol of hope, became a place families entered with dread. By the time suspicion finally turned toward Mary Ann, She had already woven her crimes into the very fabric of Richmond. She had drowned not just infants, but trust itself, trust in servants, in ritual, in the safety of sacred spaces. The murders had begun, and soon, the mask Marian wore so well would start to crack. For years, Marian's secret lay hidden beneath the silence of grief. Families mourned, priests prayed, and the cycle repeated itself. But whispers have a way of growing, and in time, the pattern became too chilling to ignore. Richmond was not a large city. Tragedies spread quickly in hushed conversations across church pews and market stalls. One household losing a child was unfortunate. Two was cruel coincidence. But when families employing Mary and seemed haunted by repeated infant deaths, suspicion crept in. At first, no one dared to speak her name. To accuse a servant of such crimes was to risk scandal, not just for her, but for the households themselves. To admit that a trusted maid could drown children at the baptismal font was unthinkable. It meant acknowledging that evil had lived not outside their doors, but within their homes. And yet, silence could only last so long. The turning point came when a child, previously healthy and strong, died under circumstances that could not be explained away. The font had once again become a place of death. This time, the family began to question the impossible. How could such a tragedy occur twice, within their bloodline, under the watch of the same servant? The coincidence was too exact, too precise. Doctors were summoned, though Victorian medicine was limited. They could not prove drowning the way modern forensics might. There were no chemical tests, no autopsies as we know them today. But doubts were forming, and those doubts began to circle Mary Ann. The whispers reached the clergy. Priests, once confident in the sanctity of their ritual, now looked uneasily at the servant who lingered so calmly near the font. Parishioners muttered about curses, about divine punishment, about evil disguised as obedience. The very space that had brought comfort to families now carried a heavy shadow. Mary and herself remained calm. She continued her duties, moved through households with the same quiet diligence as before, and met questions with silence. It was this composure, this chilling steadiness, that unnerved those around her most. Even when suspicion began to take shape, she gave nothing away. But a mask, no matter how carefully worn, cannot last forever. The investigation was slow, hesitant. Servants had few rights, but families hesitated to accuse without certainty. To bring such charges meant admitting they had placed their children in harm's way. It meant exposing themselves to shame and ridicule. Only when the deaths could no longer be explained as chance did authorities begin to act. Mary Ann was arrested. In the official records, she was described as sullen, reserved, unmoved. There were no tears, no pleas of innocence. Her silence seemed to confirm what many feared, that she had drowned children deliberately, methodically, without remorse. The trial drew immediate attention. True crime was not just a modern obsession. It captivated Victorians as well. Courtrooms became theaters, and Mary Ann's case promised a spectacle both shocking and grotesque. The galleries filled with spectators, townspeople, journalists, and those who simply wanted to see the face of a woman accused of such unspeakable crimes. The prosecution painted her as a monster cloaked in humility. They argued that she had abused the sacred trust placed in her, turning ritual into murder. Witnesses spoke of the repeated deaths, the uncanny pattern, the unsettling calm with which Mary Ann carried out her duties. The defense, desperate, leaned on explanations that remain familiar in the history of female crime. Perhaps she was insane, they argued. Perhaps she was overcome by forces beyond her control, melancholia, hysteria, some darkness of the female mind. It was easier, for Victorian society, to believe in madness than in deliberate cruelty. But the weight of evidence was not in her favor. While medicine could not provide conclusive proof, the pattern itself told a story. Too many children, too many deaths, too many fonts. Coincidence could only stretch so far before it snapped under the pressure of logic. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. Every testimony carried weight. Mothers spoke through tears, priests stumbled over their words, and neighbors whispered of curses. The press devoured every detail, printing lurid headlines that framed Mary Ann as both villain and enigma. Was she a cold-blooded killer? A servant consumed by resentment? Or simply an unfeeling shadow who had slipped too far into darkness? One journalist described her as a woman without expression, whose silence was more damning than confession. Another wrote that her eyes, calm and unblinking, seemed to pierce through the courtroom, unsettling even the judge. The jury deliberated under immense pressure. To acquit her would be to risk further deaths. To convict her was to accept that the unimaginable was, in fact, real, that a servant had drowned 2 generations of children beneath the baptismal font. In the end, the verdict was clear. Mary Ann was found guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some gasped, others wept, and still others applauded, as though justice had finally torn through the silence she carried. For Mary Ann, the sentence was death. She would hang, as so many criminals of her time had before her. There would be no mercy, no reprieve. The public demanded blood for the blood of the children lost. And yet, even in the face of her fate, Mary Ann remained composed. No desperate cries, no collapse of the mask. If she felt fear, she did not show it. If she regretted, she did not say it. The same silence that had hidden her crimes now accompanied her toward her end. The trial left Richmond shaken. Families who once trusted servants with their children now eyed them with suspicion. Priests, once unshakable in their faith, wrestled with the knowledge that their most sacred ritual had been weaponized. And the baptismal font, once a symbol of hope, stood as a grim reminder of the lives taken in silence. Mary Ann had been unmasked. But the questions she left behind, the why, the how, the silence, would haunt long after the courtroom emptied and the verdict was passed. The sentence had been passed. Mary Ann, the servant who drowned 2 generations of children in the baptismal font, would face the ultimate punishment of Victorian justice, death by hanging. Execution in the 1800s was not only a legal penalty, it was a public ritual, a grim theater of morality staged before the eyes of thousands. And for a woman, it carried an additional weight. Female executions were rare enough to spark extraordinary curiosity, and Mary Ann's crimes guaranteed a spectacle. In the weeks leading to her death, she was confined to a cold, narrow cell. The stone walls dripped with damp, the air thick with the stench of confinement. Jailers recorded her demeanor as calm, detached, even indifferent. Unlike others who wept, begged, or prayed frantically in their final days, Mary Ann remained composed. Some said her silence was unnerving, as though she had already retreated from the world. Priests visited her, urging repentance, warning of hellfire, offering salvation. But Mary Ann's responses were minimal. She confessed to nothing. She denied little. Instead, she listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the floor, her thoughts locked away. Was she grappling with guilt? Or had she already made peace with her darkness, unwilling to give her executioners the satisfaction of remorse? No one could tell. Outside the prison, anticipation grew. News of her crimes had spread far beyond Richmond, feeding the Victorian appetite for sensational trials. Broadsheets printed lurid headlines, recounting every detail of the infants drowned, the font corrupted, the servant turned killer. Crowds gathered in taverns and marketplaces to argue her motives. Some saw her as a monster, others as a madwoman, still others as a cautionary tale of the dangers lurking in the servant class. On the morning of her execution, Richmond awoke before dawn. Men, women, and even children streamed toward the gallows site. For many, this was not just justice, it was entertainment. Vendors sold bread, beer, and pamphlets. Peddlers hawked crude illustrations of Mary Ann's face, some portraying her as a demon, others as a tragic figure. The line between justice and spectacle blurred, as it so often did in Victorian England. When the prison doors opened, Mary Ann emerged flanked by guards. She wore a simple gown, her hair tied back neatly. Witnesses described her as pale but composed, her steps steady. There were no tears, no collapse of nerves. To the crowd, this composure was almost unsettling. They wanted drama, hysteria, repentance. Instead, they were met with silence. The walk to the scaffold was short, but every footstep echoed. The crowd pressed forward, craning their necks, eager to glimpse the woman whose hands had silenced so many children. Mothers clutched their own infants tightly, as if shielding them from a shadow that still lingered in the air. Fathers spat curses, demanding justice. Children, too young to understand, watched wide-eyed. sensing the tension that gripped the adults around them. At the foot of the gallows, Marian paused. The executioner, a seasoned man accustomed to hardened criminals, studied her carefully. Some accounts suggest he was struck by her lack of fear. She climbed the steps without faltering, her eyes fixed ahead, as if determined not to give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. The priest mounted the scaffold beside her, offering final prayers, urging her to repent. Marian's lips moved faintly, but no one could tell if she prayed or simply whispered to herself. Her last words, if any, were lost to history. The silence that had defined her life and her crimes followed her even here. The noose was placed around her neck. The crowd fell into a tense hush. The executioner pulled the hood over her head, and for a moment, all was still. Then, with a swift motion, the trapdoor opened. Marian's body fell, the rope snapping taut. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a roar of sound. Cheers, curses, prayers. Some turned away, unable to watch. Others leaned forward, hungry for every detail of her final moments. For a few seconds, the figure at the end of the rope swayed gently, then grew still. It was over. The servant who had murdered in silence had been silenced herself. The crowd slowly dispersed, carrying with them not just the memory of justice served, but the morbid thrill of having witnessed death firsthand. For some, the execution was a warning. Evil can hide in the most ordinary faces. For others, it was entertainment, a story to retell over ale and supper. For the families who had lost children, it was both too much and not enough. Justice achieved, but innocence gone forever. In the days that followed, pamphlets circulated with lurid accounts of the execution. Ballads were sung in taverns, blending fact with fiction. Marian became a figure of folklore, her name whispered in fear, her crimes exaggerated into legend. The baptismal font, once a sacred symbol, now carried the weight of her infamy. And yet, as quickly as the spectacle rose, it faded. Life in Richmond moved on. New scandals replaced old. The gallows stood empty, waiting for the next condemned soul. Marian's body was buried in unmarked ground, her name etched not on a tombstone, but in the dark corners of memory. But for those who had watched, and for the families who had wept, the silence she left behind was impossible to forget. The cries of children drowned in holy water lingered like an echo in the town's conscience. The executioner's noose may have ended her life, but it could not erase the shadow she had cast. Marian's story did not die with her. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily trust can be betrayed, how sacred symbols can be twisted, and how evil can hide behind the mask of servitude. Her silence on the scaffold mirrored the silence of her crimes, leaving behind a question that would haunt generations. What truly lived in the mind of the servant who turned the baptismal font into a grave? When the trapdoor swung shut and Marian's body fell, Richmond may have breathed a sigh of relief. The woman who had turned baptism into a weapon, who had drowned children in holy water, was gone. But executions never truly erase. They silence the body, yes, but the questions, the whispers, the shadows remain. In the weeks following her death, Richmond was a city unsettled. Families gathered in churches where the baptismal font now seemed less a vessel of salvation than a reminder of horror. Parents brought their infants forward hesitantly, glancing at the water with unease. Priests, once proud custodians of sacred rites, found themselves answering questions they never imagined. How could God allow his own ritual to be turned into a murder weapon? How could the holiest act be twisted into such desecration? Marian had stained not just households, but symbols. The font itself, stone, water, candlelight, became haunted. A place of beginning transformed into a place of ending. Some families refused to baptize their children at all, turning instead to private blessings. Others insisted the fonts be scrubbed and sanctified, as though soap and prayer might erase what had been done. Her story did not fade quickly. Newspapers continued to retell her crimes in lurid detail. For some, she was proof of the lurking dangers of the servant class. Victorian society was deeply stratified, and Marian's case fed the anxieties of the upper classes who relied daily on maids, nannies, and wet nurses to tend their children. To admit a servant could kill was to admit vulnerability, that power and money could not protect against betrayal inside the home. For others, Mary Ann became a figure of moral caution. Sermons warned congregations about sin hidden beneath obedience, about evil lurking in the ordinary. Her crimes were cast as proof that even the humblest face could mask corruption, that even holy water could be corrupted by human hands. And yet, there was another current of fascination. Dark as it may seem, Mary Ann's story was consumed not only with horror, but with curiosity. People wanted to understand her. Was she evil incarnate? Was she driven by madness, by resentment, by some unspoken trauma? Or was she simply an enigma, someone who carried silence as both shield and weapon? Her trial records offered little. She confessed nothing. She left no written testimony, no letters, no plea. Her silence was her legacy, and in that silence, imagination rushed in to fill the void. Some called her demon. Others pitted her as mentally broken. Still others painted her as a cold, calculating monster. Each interpretation told us less about Mary and herself, and more about the fears of Victorian society. In truth, Mary Ann was not unique. History records other servants who turned against their households, other women who killed the children they were meant to protect. But her method, drowning in the font, was singular. It transformed ordinary infanticide into something ritualistic, symbolic, unforgettable. It was not merely murder, it was desecration. And that desecration lingers. The story of Mary Ann is more than a catalog of crimes. It is a story about trust, about the thin line between ritual and horror, about the vulnerability of innocence, about the terrifying possibility that evil may wear the face of the familiar. Even now, more than a century later, her name carries a shiver. Historians debate her motives, true crime enthusiasts dissect her silence, and storytellers, like us, retrace her shadow. Each retelling keeps the memory alive, not because the crimes need celebrating, but because they force us to confront a truth society often avoids. Sometimes evil is not a monster lurking in the woods, but a quiet figure standing beside us, waiting, watching. Her execution closed one chapter, but the legend continued. Ballads, broadsides, and whispered stories turned Mary Ann into more than a criminal. She became a cautionary tale, a symbol of hidden danger. In taverns, her name was spoken with dread. In households, her story became a warning told to servants and children alike. And in churches, her shadow stretched longest, a reminder that even sacred spaces are not immune to corruption. But there is also another way to view her legacy, not through the spectacle of the scaffold, nor the fascination of the crowd, but through the silence of the victims. The infants who never grew to speak, whose futures ended in holy water, whose families carried grief into every corner of their lives. Their names are not remembered. Their faces are lost to time. Yet they are the true center of this story, the reason it still unsettles us. Mary Ann is remembered because she shocked, because she broke the boundaries of what society could imagine. But her victims are forgotten precisely because they were innocent. They left no record, no testimony, no defense. And perhaps that is the greatest tragedy, that the story of Mary Ann lives louder than the lives she took. As we close this tale, we must return to the font itself, the place where it began. Imagine the stone basin, water shimmering in candlelight, families gathered in faith, hope swelling as a child was brought forward. Now imagine the same basin, the same water, but heavy with the knowledge of what it became. That duality, the sacred and the profane, is what gives this story its power. It forces us to ask, where does safety end and danger begin? How thin is the veil between innocence and evil? Mary Ann of Richmond is gone. Her body lies in unmarked soil, her face forgotten by time. But her shadow endures. It lingers not in the gallows or the trial, but in the questions she never answered, the silence she never broke. And in that silence, we are left with only echoes, the cries of drowned innocence, and the uneasy knowledge that history is filled with darkness waiting to be uncovered.